Yeah, thank you everyone for your patience. Sorry about that, technical difficulties. Luckily you weren't here when we had to fight with the projector for 20 minutes. It ended up, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here that we had to reboot for some reason. So anyway, hi, my name is Chris. And I'm going to be talking about setting up a pleasant development environment. And so kind of what I mean by that, just to kind of get things rolling here, is you know, how many of you have like gone, like you started a new job or you tried to pull down some open source thing and it's just like days of setting up a development environment. You're frustrated, you're mad, you know, or you're trying to onboard some new person, like maybe you're the experienced one, and then you're like, hey, new guy, just do these 3 things and it'll work. And then the new guy does the 3 things and of course they don't work. So then you spend all day sitting beside them telling them, like, oh, that's right, you have to install this. Oh, that's right, you have to configure this one thing in the file so that it'll run or whatever. Oh, yeah, don't point to that database, point to this one. This is our development database. So we're going to kind of talk about some ways to avoid those kind of just in general. So it's not related to Ruby and Rails and Docker, and then of course we'll focus on that. And then towards the end, depending on how much time we have, maybe I'll go through an example. It's how everyone's feeling. If everyone feels really brave, if they have some sort of Rails application they would like to try and Dockerize, we can try it live and we can watch this whole place burn to the ground as we try that. So if everyone's feeling brave, let me know. Otherwise, we can just set up like a new Rails app. Will be kind of the demo. We'll just set up a new Rails app and Dockerize it right off the get-go. So, all right. So this is me. I run my own consulting company called Saturday Morning Productions. So I've ran it for about 10, 11 years now or something like that. Before that, I did a lot of development that was not in Ruby and Rails. It's actually just been the last couple of years that I've been working with Rails. And it's because about 2 years ago, I started with a company called Corgi Bytes. So I subcontract out with them. They're in the States. And I work 100% remote, so that's kind of fun. It's been a new experience for me. But there, I ended up working on some legacy Rails applications. So their kind of claim to fame is working on legacy code. So one of the problems we encountered real quick, well, I even encountered it during my consulting things, is you have a bunch of different clients and you need to keep like all these development environments. Like it's not just one. Like if you work at a company, you have one development environment, right? I'm assuming maybe some of you have 2. Does anyone work at a company that has multiple development environments they need to support? Like what do you need to support at your, I guess C++, Rails, and Node. So even in companies, this could be useful. Because otherwise, if you try and install that stuff on your host, it just becomes a garbled mess, and you just need to burn it and like create a new host from scratch. So yeah, if you ever need to get a hold of me, probably the easiest way for most of you is I'm Chris C on Dev Edmonton Slack. There's a little picture of me. So that's how you know it's me. But yeah, there's all the other ways you can get a hold of me. Quick talk about what a development environment is. For this talk, a development environment is basically your workstation, your laptop, your desktop, or anything. I know some companies will have a separate dev environment that's maybe shared by people. That's less common nowadays, but 20 years ago when I first started, that was a common thing, especially with a shared development database or something like that. But that's what we're talking about. We're talking about whatever is on your machine, whatever it takes to get your code from when you check it out to get it running. So that's your development environment. The only thing we're not really going to focus on for this talk is the IDE. So I'll kind of leave that up to everyone because it's very personal. Kind of like the underwear you wear, I guess, boxers, briefs, like what kind of IDE do you want to use? But for our talk, we're just going to talk about everything else. So we'll talk about like third-party libraries like gems, which versions of Ruby or .NET, like if you're a .NET developer, you use, what database do you want to point to, stuff like that. So we'll talk about how to try and set that up. So again, when a developer comes onto the project, they can get started right away. They can just check out the code, and they can instantly well, not instantly, but as quick as they can, start being productive members of your team, of your company. Or if you have an open source project, they're not like they sit there for an hour and try it, and then they just give up, and you never hear about it. So, all right, so this is kind of a quick history of development environments I've encountered, and how not really, yeah, I guess development environments encountered, and how I was supposed to set them up. So I don't know, all these slides will be posted, but do you want to picture me in there? So I've been developing for about 20 years, so if you've probably seen some of these at the same time. So the first ever job is just an oral tradition, like someone just tells you how to do it, and they usually just give you like a couple instructions. Back in my day, it was go find the MSDN CDs that you needed. I did, like, my first job was VB6. So I don't know if anyone's ever a Microsoft developer. There was a giant binder of Microsoft disks that you had. Like they would ship you new disks every year. And yeah, that was part of your MSDN subscription. So the first job was to go find that binder, realize the disk you wanted wasn't in there, and it was in some other developer's DVD player or whatever, or sitting on their shelf somewhere. Yeah, it was just all oral. Like, they would just tell you what to install, and you would just try your best, and then you would go get the other developer. They'd sit beside you for a while. Things would be working, and then something wouldn't work. You wouldn't be able to run whatever. You have to go grab them again. And then, of course, the next step was some people started documenting stuff. They put readmes, or they would write down how to set up the development environment. And then, so after that, once I started that, and then I had to get people to work on projects with me, I started trying to put good defaults in source control. So when I did like well, back in the day, it wasn't Git, it was, you know, Visual Source Safe, or that's what I used. What else was there? What did other people use?
Subversion.
Oh yeah, Subversion.
It was
yes.
only the Microsoft guys that used Visual Source.
No, yeah, it had locking too. So like someone would check out a file, and then we would go on vacation, and that file would be locked. Oh, how awesome was that? Yeah. So anyway, going back to this. So before you did like a Git checkout or whatever, you try to put good defaults in there. So when somebody checks it out, they don't have to go in there and tweak a bunch of stuff. Like, all your configs, as many as you can, are set to good defaults. Like, they point to the development database. They have the, you know, if there's an API key that you can actually put in source control, then you have like a developer API keys in there, right? Your database YAML file is all set up correctly, so a developer can just start working, right? They don't have to go in there and muck with it from a development point of view. So I find that's really handy. It's just one less step, one less thing you have to document, one less thing you have to tell somebody to do. And then what I did back in the day, which I don't do anymore, is I actually started including libraries in source control. So there'd be like a tools or a libraries folder that we would have in there, and there'd be like if you needed an ActiveX control, it would be in there, so you could just run the setup, and it would install that ActiveX control or whatever other third-party libraries you might need. I don't do this anymore because it's a lot easier to get your libraries from GitHub or Ruby or NuGet. What's the Ruby one called? Ruby Gems. The only time you see this, though, is sometimes big companies will have their own Ruby Gems server or their own NuGet server. Because every once in a while, even back in the day, sometimes things would disappear from the internet. But now GitHub Ruby Gems and NuGet and stuff are pretty good at not letting things disappear. What was that node package that disappeared a couple of years ago? Yeah, and it just like blew up everything. So yeah, so bigger companies, you'll often find they will have their own. Like you won't go to NuGet.org or RubyGems.org. You'll go to the internal one, and they'll have all the ones pulled down and cached locally.
They'll actually vet.
Yeah, they'll vet them and cache them. Yeah. So yeah, I don't do that anymore and again, things like NuGet and Bundle have taken care of a lot of this too. A lot of the stuff that you needed to install back in the day, it wasn't there. And then of course there's scripts. So you could script out like a bash script or whatever. Some of the setup instructions you could have. And then when I started consulting, one thing I noticed real quick is it was really hard to install Visual Studio, multiple versions of Visual Studio, SQL Server. Maybe my clients were on different versions of Windows. Again, I was a Windows guy at the time. So that was all really tricky. So to manage that, I started using virtual machines. So I'd have a virtual machine for each client, and that way I could have their unique version of SQL Server, their unique version of Visual Studio, and it was all nice and isolated. I didn't have to worry about conflicts or anything like that. You know, their version of Windows. Like maybe they're on Windows Service Pack 1 and someone else wasn't. So, and last but not least, when I started at Corgi Bytes, I'd heard about Docker before I started there, but they use it a lot there, and they really introduced me to it. So that's why I kind of give them props at the beginning there. And at first I was like, I don't know about this Docker thing. We should just stick with virtual machines. But after a month or two of working there, I was hooked on Docker for my development environment. All right, so these are kind of the things that I think make a good development environment. Again, we talked about the good defaults. So when somebody checks something out, everything is all ready for you, the developer, right? Someone's thought ahead of what you're going to need, and they set it up for you already, right? It should be documented and automated as much as possible. So even if you've automated the heck out of it, you should probably still have some documentation about what to do, right? So when we talk about Docker, we're going to talk about the command lines you're going to have to run. There's usually always some API keys or something that you're going to probably have to configure. It's nice to have that documented. Like our documentation a lot of times says, hey, to configure these values, go to our 1Password account and set them up, right? And then 1Password will have a list of their, like, here's all your developer API keys you need for this particular client. It should be reproducible and portable, so you can blow it away on your machine, your development environment, just boop, and you should be able to reproduce it real quick. And it should also be portable. My development environment should be the same as any of yours. Sorry, I can't remember anyone's name. I know, Chris. So we have another Chris, because there's always got to be 2 Chris's at least. So the 2 Chris's, we have to have the same development environment, right? Like if I'm using ImageMagick version whatever, what's the latest version of ImageMagick? You guys are all the Ruby guys, 7? If I'm using 7.1, then Chris should be using 7.1 as well, right? He should not be using 6 or something like that, because that's when you get the it works on my machine situation, but doesn't work on mine. So we should be very portable. Versioned. This was something that someone pointed out to me just the other day. Actually, someone from Corgi Bytes when we were discussing this. It's nice to have a versioned one. So if I pull, if I pull a development, if I want to check out what everything looked like 2 months ago, I can just pull it out and I'll get the development environment that should be valid 2 months ago. So if you had an older version of ImageMagick, maybe an older version of Rails or something like that, that should be all represented and in version control along with your source code. So that's really nice to have. Self-contained, so that goes back to where I had multiple development environments I need to maintain. I didn't want them clobbering each other or getting in the way of each other. So it's nice that they're self-contained, they don't conflict with each other. You don't have to have you don't have to worry about which version of Ruby you're running, anything like that. Or like, again, back to my case, when you had Visual Studio, you could have separate instances of Visual Studio installed and they didn't clobber each other. And then the last one, this is less about like development environment. This is just, again, this is like it works on my machine or it works in production. It doesn't work on my machine or it works on development, doesn't work in production. Try to get it as close to production as you possibly can. So if your development environment is on Windows, but your production environment runs on Ubuntu or something like that, that's not great, right? You probably want your development environment to match your production environment as close as possible. Like if you're using, like what's the default web server that comes with Rails now? Puma? Yeah, so if you're using Puma, but like in production you're using like Passenger or Apache or something like that, then you probably want your development environment. You should probably update that to be Passenger as well. And it doesn't happen that often, but every once in a while you get that weird bug and you try and reproduce it in your development environment, and for the life of you can't, and it's because like you have Passenger has some weird quirk to it that you don't have set up, that you just can't mimic. So so I don't know, does anyone else, you've all set up development environments before. Does anyone else have any suggestions about what makes a good development environment for them? Or this is the chance if you want to vent. You horrible ones, good ones that you used before? I'm curious. Oh, wow, that's even a step above what I was going to talk about. I was going to make you run those Docker command lines manually, but sorry, what was your name? Marinas. Did I say that correctly? Yeah. Marinas? Yeah, so he just mentioned, I guess for the video there, he just mentioned that you had 5, you said, different environments? Yeah. So yeah, and then you had a script that you would run that would actually. There's also like a VCR gem that you can record and replay. I guess the next thing is so kind of back to this. Who's used Docker before? A couple people? All right, so you're going to find out quickly. I'm not a real Docker expert or anything, but who's used Docker to set up development environments? A couple people. How about, have you gone all the way to production? That's something I haven't had the chance to do yet. We set it up, usually our clients have their own server set up with whatever, and we just mimic it as close as we can using Docker. Cool. Okay. So for those of you've never used Docker before, one way to think about it is this nice way to encapsulate your application and all of its dependencies. So it's kind of like a virtual machine, but on a smaller scale. So a virtual machine is basically a whole OS and everything running, where a Docker image or container just sits on top of your existing OS. So you can have multiple Docker containers. They're called containers, sitting on top of your OS. And the nice thing is they're nice and isolated. So it's like kind of encapsulates all your source code and everything, but it also encapsulates any third-party dependencies you have, like ImageMagick, your version of Ruby, any gems you have, stuff like that. That's all encapsulated and isolated from everything else. So that's kind of what Docker gives you. And then, of course, there's a nice write-up up there. What else do I want to say about Docker for this discussion? Well, you can read a whole bunch about it, but that's kind of the biggest thing that it gives you, is that nice isolation. And then the nice thing is, too, is that once you have that container, you can use it for development. You can pass it on to your staging server, and then eventually you can pass it on to production, which I haven't had a chance to play around with. Other people on our team have, and they've been successful with it. And yeah, so it sounds like some other people have, but yeah, I just haven't had the opportunity yet. It's hard to convince clients to do that, and it's a lot of work, right? You have quite a bit of infrastructure you have to change. If your client has an existing server set up, you have to convince them to get off of that and set up a, Kubernetes or something like that. So. Any kind of just questions about Docker? No? The other way I think about it in the context of this discussion is it's like running setup.exe for your development environment. Kind of like, sorry, what was your name again? Marinus. How he just had like a script that would run that would set everything up. Kind of like this, only like they took it a step further. Now I feel incompetent. So. And again, so like, why do I like Docker so much? It's kind of, if we go back to those steps that we had before, what makes a good development environment, Docker meets most of them. Kind of the only one it doesn't, you still have to have good defaults for your Docker setup, right? And I like to set up my Docker files, at least right now, for development environments. So when Docker, you could set it up, for those of you that don't know, you set up Docker as basically a file. It's like a config file, and it tells you what you want your Docker container to have, right? I want Ruby 2.5. I want these third-party apps like ImageMagick installed. I want, and then what else would it set up there? I want this port open. So it's also contained enough that it's almost like its own little mini virtual machine as well, is that you set up ports on it as well. So you have to connect to certain ports and stuff. We'll cover some of that. But yeah, you have a file that lists all those configuration settings for you. And then when you run a command, it'll read that config file, and it'll build your Docker container for that, based on that config file. So in that case, it's really automated. So, so this is where I forgot my notes that Matt had there. So it's automated, right? And it's kind of the self-documentation thing. It's reproducible. So if I have the same Docker file that, again, my other buddy Chris has, then if we both run it, we're both going to do the exact same environments. It's versionable because it's just a config file. We put it into Git. It just usually just sits at the root of the Ruby folder. But if you have a bunch of Docker configurations, sometimes you'll have a separate folder for it. But it's there, it's versioned. So if I want to get an old version, if we need to update something in Docker, we can update it in a branch, like maybe we have a development branch. So we'll update the version of ImageMagick in the development branch. We'll test it there. We'll push that to our staging branch, then we'll test it there, and then we'll push it to our production branch, right? So you can kind of get that rolling test going as well. So assuming you're running Docker in production. If you're not, then you do that, and then maybe in staging, you just manually go and install it once you're happy that's working in development. But man, what were the other ones? Does anyone remember? Versionable, as close to production as you can get it. The nice thing about Docker, even if you're not running Docker in production, is that there's quite a few built-in Docker images that you can pull from that people have set up that have various versions of Ubuntu, various Postgres database versions whatever Postgres database version that you want. There's like Redis ones. What other ones would Ruby guys use? They have an image for Ruby, different versions of Ruby that you would want. So.
Full stack web testing, you might want an image with like capybara and all the web stack.
No, well, that's part of your gems usually, right? So that part's not included in the Docker setup?
It does have native requirements and stuff.
Oh, yeah, you might need like Chromium or something, right? Oh, Qt. Yeah. So in those cases, yeah.
Yeah, the
Yep.
headless browsers and stuff.
Yeah, right. Because you need, Chromium or Qt or something. And then what else did I have up there?
Does it mess with the rest of your system?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Yeah, Docker is nice and isolated. So on my Mac there, I have several clients and I have separate Docker images for them, and they don't conflict with each other. So one thing you'll note too is I don't have our Ruby environment or RVM installed on this machine. So everything like those Docker containers encapsulate the version of Ruby, right? So you don't have to worry about switching back and forth between the two. I don't have to worry about gems conflicting with each other. Like none of that. They each is its own self-contained container. Any questions? How's everyone doing? I know it's been a long No, those I put on the host.
You do?
Yeah.
So there's
Yeah.
still some apps that you're gonna maintain on a host level?
Yeah, like your IDE lives on the host level, right? And then everyone can have a separate IDE. So that part's kind of nice. So like I use RubyMine. Some other people on our team, they like to use VS Code and Pry, or they're hardcore Vim or some crazy thing like that. That I never really understood. Yeah, so that part. So on my Mac, I could show you. I just have all the JetBrains, like all the JetBrains tools, but I don't have like. I think Mac comes with Ruby by default, but I don't install any other versions of Ruby.
Yeah, it does, but you gotta be careful because it's an older version.
Yeah.
And that's stopping, actually.
Yeah.
That will not be installed by default in some.
Oh, okay, yeah. And so same thing if you're running in a Windows environment and you're using .NET, like you don't have to have that version of .NET installed on your machine. There are Docker images out there for various versions of .NET, like .NET Core 2, 3, whatever the heck you want to use, right? So, yeah, and if anyone has any questions, by all means reach out to me on Dev Edmonton Slack. Thank you.
Chris? Great.